Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to TAM Lab number 14. Today we're excited to have Jim Strite joining us. Jim's going to be going through a nested NSX lab deployment via scripting and automation, which kind of follows on to a recent blog that he wrote around why everyone needs an NSX nested lab sandbox. So with that, I will stop sharing and hand it over to Jim.
Cool. Hey guys, thanks for joining. Today, I'm going to just kind of go over my nested lab environment. Now, I'll preface this with, this is not the only way to do a nested lab. I'm not saying this is the best way to do a nested lab. This is the way that I do my nested labs. This is how I've been doing my nested labs for a while. This is also how I've helped a few of my customers build nested labs in their environments too. So with that said, I'll just kind of go over my environment a little bit, and then we'll go from there. Let's see, we got some echoes on the phone.
Let me shut off mine.
Okay. Cool. So my environment is really, I kind of have three servers. I've got one larger server. It's a DL380 Gen 7. It's got 144 gigs of RAM. And I've got a couple of smaller machines that are 32 gigs of RAM. These two machines kind of make up my, what I'll call my management cluster, for a better term. And then the rest of the environment is kind of where I do all my nesting stuff. I've built the virtual center and nested hosts, and I've done that so many times that I started looking to script it just to help me build out my environments a little bit quicker. One of the things I like to do is I like to build labs that kind of mimic my customers' environments. So if they're running a specific version of ESXi and a specific version of NSX, then I try to kind of essentially mimic their environments. That way, if they have a question about something they're seeing on a screen, I can go and I can reference that environment and I can see kind of what it looks like, because we do change the UI sometimes from version to version, right? The other thing I can do then is I can walk through like a potential upgrade or something like that. I use my nested labs so that I'm kind of like a kinetic learner, right? I gotta breathe it, smell it, touch it, feel it to really learn it. The more I know about it, the more confident I am, and I can go and have a better conversation with my customer. And that's kind of how I use my nested labs. Does that kind of make sense with what everybody else uses for their labs? So what I'm going to do is the thing I'm going to show today is my nested script. The script was originally built by William Lamb, and then I went in and I tweaked out some things and added some things to the script to optimize it for my environment and how I was using my nested labs. So can I have somebody just give me a suggestion for a name for to use for this nested lab? And the reason is I put a name behind all this, and then it makes it a lot easier to kind of consolidate and visualize everything that's happening with this. So does anybody have like a suggestion for a name?
If you want to call it TAM Lab 14, that'd be good.
TAM Lab 14. All right, cool. So what I'm going to do is we're just going to go ahead and I'm going to start this script. The only thing that I did is I made a quick change, and I'll go over this script as this is running, but since the script takes about 35 minutes to run, I wanted to make sure that we had enough time. So we'll go ahead. I put in a customer name as a variable in my script, and we're going to go launch this. First thing that it does is it goes and it creates some DNS records for me. That way I can, during the rest of the builds, I can reference everything by an FQDN and not just an IP address. And if I go look at my DNS server, which in my home, it's just a Windows 2012 server. If I come and look at this real quick, do a refresh, I now see 3 new variables in here that are my TAM labs. It's a virtual center that's being built and 2 nested ESXi hosts. Does it make sense so far?
Yep.
The other thing that it does for me is it builds out a couple of port groups. The way I build my nested lab environments is I create a port group for the kind of the nested environment, and then I also create another port group that is kind of connected on my main network. That what we have to do in order for nesting to really work is we have to turn on promiscuous mode and MAC and forged transmits. And I don't want that across my port group for all of the VMs in my environment. So I create a port group just for this nested lab. These machines are then connected to these port groups, and the promiscuous part or the transmits and everything stay kind of contained within that port group area, and it doesn't impact all the rest of my environment. So what it does is connects to my primary virtual center, and we'll jump over to here real quick, and it creates 2 port groups for me. We've got our TAM lab tenants. That's where I put my virtual machines, and then my TAM lab transit, and that's the port group that I use to connect everything else to, and that's just the name. If I come look at this port group, you can see the VMs are already being assigned to them. And if I look at the settings, my script has already changed the promiscuous mode, MAC, and forged transmits for me. And the real big reason that you need this in a nested lab is if you have MAC address or forged transmits are set to reject, which is the default setting, your VM, your nested host, if you have a VM that's running inside that and it wants to take and try to talk to another one, it's going to have a different MAC address, right? And by default, it would take and prevent that from going through if we didn't allow these changes. So there we go. This is starting to kind of build out. I'll just kind of walk through this script a little bit here some more. I've got an ESXi host that it's going to build. And then there's another host that it's building. So in my configuration, and I'll show you this where that's configurable, it's deployed those 2. In my environment, I'm also creating an NSX edge router to connect my nested network to my regular network. Now, that's not a requirement. I use it just because I have NSX in my environment. But you can build a nested environment without having to use NSX. You don't need to do that. There's other ways to have those separate networks and still be able to transmit or have traffic flowing between those networks without having to use NSX. In my environment, I'm using NSX, so it is building out it's connecting to my NSX manager, and it goes and creates an edge for me. Here's my TAM lab edge that it's created for me. And it will also take and it puts in some NAT rules and some other basic things in there for me automatically. The way I have my nested labs configured is it's kind of like your home network at home, where any VM that's running in the nested lab environment can reach out and communicate with anything on the rest of my network or out onto the internet, but nothing can go back into it. It's just like how your home router is at home, where all the machines inside your house, you can talk to each other, and you can go out to the internet, but things from the internet can't come back in and talk to your machines. Then, this is the long part here. Then it starts building out a virtual center. And I'm not cloning virtual centers from like an existing one. This builds me a fresh, brand new virtual center every time it does a deployment. And that's where this other little window kind of pops up, because this takes forever. Somebody was clever enough to figure out a way to see all of the process that is happening at the VCSA when it's being deployed. And I added that into my script as well. So it's done with the disk part. This will continue doing additional things as we go. At this point, I'll kind of let this keep going, and I'll jump into the script, into the variables. Anybody have any questions at this point right now, though?
There's one guy, Mike Dub wants to talk about hardware, but he has to leave right now, and so he just wants it on the recording. So if there's anything
Sure.
hardware you want to go over.
Is there anything specific, Mike, that you have that you want to know about hardware? Or has he already jumped off?
It looks like he's still on. He's just on mute.
So I don't have anything. I'll just talk about my hardware real quick. I don't have anything super specific in my environment. I've got used equipment. I try to keep the cost down, and my wife's spending factor ratio or whatever it is happy. So I don't spend a lot of money on my lab. Most of my equipment is used equipment. Like I said, I've got a DL380 G7 that's running in my environment right now. I've got a couple of Lenovo TS140s that make up that management cluster that I kind of talked about. I have another little document here real quick that I can show you. My home lab. It's nothing special. I don't have some great big cool looking rack or anything like that. I've got a couple Lenovo desktops, and then my DL380. I have a little 5-drive bay little HP server that's all it's doing is it's acting as it's a FreeNAS server for me. Presents my storage out as iSCSI. And I've got just a super basic TP-Link 1 gigabit switch. It can do jumbo frames and it can do VLANs, but it's not like a special Cisco switch or Arista switch or any high-end kind of switch. It routes packets. I mean, it doesn't route. It's not a router. It pushes packets, and that's about it. It just provides that connectivity. All the rest of the routing or networking functionality that I do in my environment, I do with NSX, and that's kind of shows the power that the software has, because I've got pretty much the dumbest piece of hardware underneath it, and I can still do anything that is being done in an enterprise environment on top of this basic hardware. I also have just a little Raspberry Pi that sits that sits out on the side here. I use that to mimic a physical device. So if I want to take and do some sort of connectivity between a VM and a physical device, I do some connectivity with my little Raspberry Pi. So I kind of do that. When everything's up and running in my environment, it's about 250 to 300 kilowatts. So where I live, that equates to about $22 to $26 a month in electricity. And it's pretty quiet. The processors that I have in my DL380 are Xeon, the low power processors. So they're They're pretty energy efficient, and they're quiet, and they don't kick out a lot of heat. I know other people have done other things, like with supermicros in their environment. You know, Chris, you've got different hardware as well. I think you've got some HP Z820s. I have some friends who have some HP Z620s in their environment, and that's how they make up their labs. So hardware can really vary across the board to a whole bunch of different things. I try to minimize the expense that I put into it, so all my stuff's used stuff. Any other questions? I'll talk a little bit more about my home lab. All of the, I'll call it my family devices, like our TV, our Apple TVs, iPads, laptops, cell phones, stuff like that. They live in a different part of my network, so none of that is relies on anything that's running in my lab. So I can go in and wreck stuff. I can blow up my lab. I can do anything in my lab, and without the fear of disrupting, you know, a Netflix binging episode for my wife or my kids or whatever, or prevent my kids from logging in and doing their homework on their laptops or anything like that. The bottom part here kind of shows just a regular workstation, my little storage server, my DL380, and my 2 Lenovo TS140s. So I'll jump back to the script a little bit. The script helps and builds out these things that are in blue here. It builds out a nested virtual center, 2 EXXI hosts, and an NSX edge for me. It doesn't do any deployment of machines inside my nested environment. If the script and everything works properly, we should be able to go in, and I can show you what I do for VMs inside that. I use a real small Linux distribution called TinyCore that allows me to make very small Linux machines, and I've got a couple little programs in it that I can do some basic connectivity testing, and that's really what I use my labs for. I'm not looking to stress test or scale test things. I just want to see the basic functionality and prove out that it can work. Like I said, it creates some DNS entries for me. We went through that, the port groups, built out a number of hosts for me, and I'll show you where that's configurable. So right now I'm having it just build out 2, but if I wanted it to build out 6 for me, it could build out 6 of them. Creates that edge, deploys a virtual center. Once the virtual center is deployed, it'll go into the virtual center. Oh, actually, in my primary virtual center, it creates a VM folder and puts all these VMs into that folder. Again, it's just for an organization perspective. The other reason that I did this was for a couple of my customers, then they could give Virtual Center access just to that folder, and then people could have access to their nested environment and not somebody else's nested environment. It configures vMotion, DNS, and iSCSI for all of my nested hosts. Like I mentioned before, I use FreeNAS as my storage server, and storage is presented out with iSCSI. I can then mount that in my little nested environment so that it looks just like a regular typical environment. It creates a data center, it creates a cluster, and it creates a VDS in that brand new virtual center for me. Connects those hosts to the cluster in the VDS. It renames a couple of the networks. One of the networks that you'll see is my 192.168.1. That's kind of like my core network. That's my regular network. And the other one is the network that I've defined to give it a unique address space. And then it rescans for storage that gets added, and it adds those data stores if I've got storage that's presented to them already. So we'll look at this. Let's see how this is doing. This is good. The deployment telling me it's still running. 52 out of 100 different services that it's doing. So far this is looking good. As long as we're seeing progress here, we know everything is still working. So inside the script, what lives inside the script? I've got a IP address of my main virtual center. So this is the virtual center that's running my actual physical devices. I've just got a basic user for it. This is the name of my data center and the cluster that I want this to be built in. Here's the variable that I give it. It's called the customer name. It can be called whatever you want, but it's just an indicator that I have that prepends or it's a prefix on all of these different items, so that when I go look in my nested environment, it's kind of a lot easier to see all the machines for a specific nested environment. I'll jump over real quick and I'll look at a couple of the other environments that I have. So for example, all of these devices I know are part of the same nested environment. It's underneath my little vPod here. So this is a one nested environment that has 4 hosts in it. Here's another one that's got 3 hosts in it. And another one that has 3 hosts in it. And so I can have all of these running at the same time. Today, for the purpose of a demonstration, I pretty much shut everything down that didn't need to be running, just because I didn't want to have any sort of performance issues while this was going on. Then I point to an ESXi OVA that William Lamb has already kind of tweaked to be able to accept variables on the fly. And then the path to my VCA, my virtual center, right? And this is just the ISO that is extracted into a folder format. So nothing special with that. Here's the number of hosts that I want to deploy. This is kind of cool. So right now I'm deploying 2 hosts. If I wanted to deploy more, all I would have to do is add in how many more I wanted to have, right? I could have host 3 and host 4, and this is the IP address that I want to provide those, and it'll just loop through this part of the script as many times as it needs to in order to build out how many hosts that I want. So if I want 1, 2, 3, 5, 10, whatever, I can just define it right here. DNS records, this yes or no just says, go make DNS records for me, yes. If I say no, then it just skips that part of the script. And then the zone in my network is just called home lab. This is where I define how large I want each one of my nested hosts to be. 2 vCPUs by 8 gigs of RAM. I could make this 4 by 16, whatever. You can define that there at that point. I'm just going to remove those for the sake of consistency. Here's where are the variables for my virtual center. So it prepends that customer name that we gave to my virtual center. Here's the IP address that I wanted to use for that virtual center. Here's the FQDN for it. Here is the SSO domain name, essentially, and the passwords that I'm going to provide for root and for administrator. And then if I want to have SSH enabled on the virtual center, yes or no, true or false. Here is where it builds out the port groups. So this is where I called mine transit and tenants. You could call it port group A and port group B. It doesn't matter. This is my virtual switch that it needs to connect to create those port groups. This is the data store where my VMs will live on. some basic IP information like my DNS and my NTP records, and my syslog server. This is also where it creates a folder for me in that folder structure. Here's where it renames a couple of those port groups that we'll see later on. Here's an iSCSI target IP address that I want to have those machines to be added to those virtual hosts or those nested hosts. Here is logging into my NSX environment, my NSX manager, to go and create an NSX edge for me. I can say yes or no to have that edge created or not. And then where is it going to go create it? Here's the cluster I want it created, and that's the data store I want it to live on. Here's some NAT rules that I mentioned about the NAT. Here's some peer storage information that's in the script. The reason it's here for me right now is because, like I said, I've mentioned a couple, I've done this at some customers. I had one of my customers that had a pure storage array in their lab, and they wanted to configure storage on the fly every time they built out another nested lab. So we put in, right now it says no because it'll just skip that part of the script for me because I don't have a pure storage array at home. But here's the username and password in order to log into that. And then this would be the volumes and the size of the volume that you want to have created on your pure storage array. Basically, that's what I need to modify is any of those settings. And in reality, I'm just, for home, I'm just going and changing a couple of those things. One, my customer name, which changes the name of all of the prefix for all of these machines, and 2 IP addresses. The rest of the time, I usually leave everything else alone. The rest of the script is the process of building out all of these things, right? Then what I've done is I've created this is going to build out a 6.7 environment, but I have other scripts, another one that would build out a 6.5 environment, and it's pointing to some different OVAs and pointing to a different virtual center extraction, right? And I also have a 6.0 environment as well.
I'm just going to ask that, Jim. So if you wanted to do 6.0, you would just change the 2 OVAs, or is the script have to be different for 6.0?
Actually, the script varies a little bit, and that's because 6.5, for example, has a few different attributes and some attribute names that are associated with the virtual center. When you do a scripted deployment of a virtual center, it uses a couple different variables. So my script, I've taken that into account and already has those variables and those variable names associated with it. So that's why I've got different scripts for each one. It's more than just changing the OVA for ESXi and the installer path. There are just a couple little minor changes that I've came across in each of the versions of the virtual center. So I've made a script for each one of those that already has those changes in it.
Right, that's good to know.
Cool. All right, so this is still cooking away. We're on step 86 out of 100. Still cruising away, so that's all good. Any other questions for anybody at this point? I'm not paying attention to the chat, so if there was something in chat.
I'm monitoring chat, and it's kind of slowed down a little bit. But is there blogs that we could go to that have a lot of detailed information about this?
Yeah, good question. So I recently just had something released earlier this month on why everybody needs an NSX nested lab. And again, this is all kind of from an NSX perspective. It's not required. It's from an NSX perspective because that's my job. I'm an NSX TAS, an account specialist with NSX. So I wrote this from a perspective from NSX, but a lot of these same things still apply across the board. So what is a nested lab and why it's important to have? So if you just search on VMware NSX nested lab, you can see this little blog article. In this article, there is a link to a tech document, and this tech document is something that I put together that takes you through the entire process of building out a nested lab step by step. So this would be this document covers the step-by-step process to build this out. Essentially the manual process of what is being done by my script. And it builds out again, an NSX Edge, but a couple nested hosts and a virtual center. In my example here, I've got 3 different hosts, kind of what it looks like from a DNS perspective, and kind of the order to do it, and some things to keep in mind as you're building it, so that as you go through the process manually, if you want to manually build it, you're ready for each next step. And I tried to include as many pictures as possible where relevant, so that a screenshot's worth 1,000 words sometimes, and it makes a lot more sense when you can actually see something. So those are a couple. I can send the group the links, these direct links to here. There's also a bunch of other websites and blog articles. William Lamb, like I said, who's a VMware employee, he's put out a bunch of different nested lab stuff over the years. There's a couple other articles that are out there. Kind of seems to be a popular subject right now. Of other people and how they built out their nested labs. So there's a number of other articles and documents that can be found on the internet as well. Cool. It looks like we're getting pretty close here to having it completed. It's adding my iSCSI targets. And so let's go through here real quick. It finished the virtual center. It created that. Let's do this real quick. Created that folder called TAM Lab 14. It moved all the devices into it. There we go. All right. So it took just under 30 minutes for it to deploy this environment, and it should be totally up and running. It took and added my iSCSI targets to my hosts, enabled vMotion, and added it to the cluster and then the data store, rescanned it, and there we go. So all green, that means we didn't run into any errors. It deployed it and gave me a total time here. So let's go look at what we have. Here's my TAM Lab 14 folder that we saw that it created. There's all my VMs that are associated with that environment. If DNS and everything works well for me, I should be able to go to TAM Lab 14 vcenter.home.lab. Cool. Go into the Flex client. I could, I guess, go into the H5 client. Hopefully this comes up in just a second. We know what it's like to log into Virtual Center the first time. So it took and created a data center. Oh yeah, my licenses, right? Because it didn't add any licensing. Data center, I created a cluster called TAM Lab 14. Added those 2 hosts. And it's doing it with an FQDN. It's not adding them by an IP address. If we look at one of the hosts, we'll look at one of the data stores. There is a couple different data stores that it found that were connected through iSCSI. And if I go, I've got, in this particular data store, I've got a couple, 3 VMs it looks like, that are already in this data store. What I can go do now is I can go register these real quick. Register VM. Put it in there. Cool. I'm going to go to VM number 3. Register that one, and we'll go to VM number 2. We'll do the same thing for that. Cool, so if I look, there we go. So I've got 3 VMs that are inside of a VM. And now we'll power these on. And one of the things, like I said, that I really like about these little tiny core VMs are 1 CPU, you know, as a minimum, right? But only 128 megs of RAM in order to run these. Of course, it's going to pop up and it's going to want to ask me, why is this showing up here? And I moved it. Sure. Power this on. Power this one on. Come answer my questions. I copied it, whatever, doesn't matter. Take a quick look. And there we go. I've got a graphic interface. Now, I'm going to go use Workstation real quick because this distribution, this little tiny Linux distribution, doesn't work super awesome with a graphical interface. So if I use Workstation to connect to it, then it works perfectly fine. Has nothing to do with the nested part, it's the Linux distribution. Cool, so I can open up a little terminal emulator. All right. this IP address was a network that I kind of defined. It's already been given to this VM, but that network was defined in my script on what I wanted my transit network to be. Oops, wrong script. So 172.168.60 network, and the same thing with my edge server. So 172.16.60.1 is my default gateway, so I should be able to ping that. Oh, hold on. I probably need to go like this and go connect them to a network. So I want to connect it to that 60 network and say that it's connected. Because all I did was register the machine. Yay, there we go. So I'll do that real quick for these other two. Connect that one. And, whoops. Sorry about that. Clicked the wrong thing. So if I go open up like O2, for example, I'm going to look at, this one is .11. So if I ping 172.16.60.1, that's my gateway. That looks good. And if I ping .10, that's VM01. Cool. Should also be able to do. Cool. So that's reaching from, that is, those machines don't show up anywhere in my primary environment. That's because, see, 01, for example, is running on host 02. That's running inside this VM right here, right? And it's going out through this VM, through the network. And that's how that can work. Any questions? Does this all make sense? Anybody want this script?
Yes, I definitely want it. One question I have, you set up NSX as your backbone on your main vCenter, correct?
That is correct, yes.
And are you using V or T?
Right now I'm using V.
Okay.
But that's a good question. So if you look at, bring this back over here real quick. When it builds out the nested lab, it really built out this stuff right here in the blue, right? You guys can see that. So a nested host has got kind of two legs. One of them is connecting into my regular network, my 192.168.1 network. That's where like my virtual center, that's like my main core network, whatever I want to say. That's where all my regular stuff is. The other network connection goes off to that 172.16.60 network, right? So this VM, I'm connecting to that network and it's going out through an edge. If I wanted to, I could connect it to the .1 network and I could give it a .1 address, and this is where I wouldn't need to use NSX. I could still run a VM, and instead I would just connect it to this the port group that's connecting out to my primary network. If I connect the VM to this network, it's on this side. If I connect it to this network, then it's essentially coming out this interface, the virtual switch that's on this interface, and I can go just directly right out into this environment.
Oh, that's good. Really quick to get up that many hosts and infrastructure.
Yeah, and the main place where it takes everything, the time to build everything, is that virtual center. You could see that the hosts can get deployed in about a minute and a half, maybe 2 minutes. So, you know, I could have, like I said, I could have an environment that have 4 nested hosts or 6 nested hosts, and it would only take a couple more minutes longer to deploy an entire environment. This is how, again, kind of like how I like to do it, right? There's a virtual center for each one of these nested labs or nested environments. There's nothing that says, though, that I couldn't stand up some of these hosts and connect it to the virtual center that's running right here, and I could make those nested hosts show up just like my physical hosts. And at one point in time, that's what I did for a while in my lab when I didn't have enough resources to have individual virtual centers. I would just make another cluster that had all my nested hosts in those clusters. And that way I didn't get confused, or I didn't mess up or try to do something between a nested host and a physical host, even though you could do if you set your EVC properly, you could vMotion between a nested host and a physical host. Oh, and then real quick, as I say that, so this host right now this VM is running on host 02. Another thing I like about these little tiny core VMs is that, so we'll come over to number 1 here, and I'll ping my gateway. We'll just let this start running, right? We'll take this, it's on 2. I'm just gonna vMotion it over to 1. We'll move it over to 1. I'll leave it on the same network, right? And boom, all right, it's already done. It's running on 01 now, and never dropped a ping, right? So these real tiny, small nested VMs are super awesome to be able to do that, because you can take and put a machine in a maintenance mode, or test that vMotion works, or a feature works, and they're really easy to power on and power off, and they don't take a whole ton of resources.
Do you have to put tools on those little VMs?
They do, actually. These little tiny VMs do, because it's actually showing me the IP address of those VMs. And so I was able to get VM tools working on these little tiny VMs.
Is it the open source or right off the server?
It's the open source version, because these are tiny core, the Linux distribution, and kind of had to manually add them. And then if I wanted to right now, I can, like if I took and tried to ping from my workstation, there we go. I'm pinging from my workstation. I'm pinging a VM, that .10 VM that was inside there. Questions? Anybody else want to do this? Anybody want help doing this?
I will probably be doing it in about a month once I get all my infrastructure set up.
Did I miss anything crucial? Is there like a missing piece of information that somebody would like to know more about?
When you were going through the script, I got one question. Where did you mark what data store you want the host to get written to? I missed that part.
Sure. VM data store.
Okay, there it is. Okay, thanks. Because I saw later where you were adding data stores to the host after the fact. I was just wondering where that was.
Yeah, so that was when I was doing the iSCSI part. That's going through the configuration. My adapters right here. Just close this out, give me a little bit more real estate. So this is the target that I added, that 192.191. This is the target of my iSCSI device. So this is actually pulling storage directly from the same storage that my physical servers come from, that little FreeNAS server. And then in FreeNAS, I've got it configured to do a share. I can pop open that real quick. So I've got 100 gig, essentially like an extent, a little volume that I created. And I'm associating it with a target, a LUN ID. And the authorized access for that is the 60s right here. So I said, I've got a machine that's got 61 and 62 as an IP address. It's device number 2, and that's how I share that out, and only those machines can then have access to this. Now, this stuff inside of FreeNAS is not automated. This I have to go set up manually. I wish FreeNAS had some PowerShell script capabilities that I could, if that was possible, like what you can do with the pure storage array. I would have this in my script, but unfortunately, FreeNAS, it's not something that FreeNAS offers. So this part of the storage I build out manually and then connect to it from right here. But the local storage on the host is coming from the physical server itself, because it's one of the data centers there. Cool.
No, this was great. Thank you.